Are you a choir leader? Do you sometimes feel like you don't know what you're doing, or you've run out of ideas? Do you wish you could pick the brain of that choir leader who seems to know what they're doing? Well, wish no more. In each episode of this podcast, we talk with successful choir leaders and ask them all about their methods, philosophies, and secrets of the trade. If you're a fan of the show, consider becoming an official patron. Head to www.patreon.com/Dan Bennett to learn more. If we get enough Patreon supporters, we could keep this show going for who knows how long. Now, on with the show. My guest today is Canberra-based composer, conductor and performer Dan Walker. He is one of Australia's most in-demand choral specialists. His compositional output includes commissions for Gondwana Voices, the Queensland Symphony Orchestra, Leichhardt Espresso Chorus, Voices Youth Choir, the Birralee Blokes, the Nittany Valley Children's Choir of Pennsylvania, and Halcyon. Recently, his large work, Mass of Deliverance, was a finalist of the 2015 APRA AMCOS Art Music Awards. Dan is also an active arranger and regularly produces work for the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, Hong Kong Philharmonic Orchestra, the Australian Chamber Orchestra, and record label ABC Classics. His work for television includes the iconic 2009 I Still Call Australia Home advertising campaign for Qantas. As a performer, Dan is a member of Canberra vocal ensemble Luminescence Chamber Singers and regularly sings with Pinchgut Opera. He is a keenly sought-after conductor, having appeared as a chorus master for Cantillation, the Sydney Symphony and Melbourne Orchestras. He is also music director of the Canberra Choral Society, the Oriana Chorale, and Canberra Community Chorale. Welcome to the show, Dan Walker.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So, I've been listening to your compositions on SoundCloud and on YouTube. There's a lot up there. It's a very impressive output.
There is. Yeah, it's making its way through the ether.
Yes, all through the interwebs. So, tell us about your composing process and arranging process. What's that like?
Sure. So generally, the majority of my output is purely commission-based. Having sort of come through various choral programs, sung with choirs ever since university, I've sort of been pigeonholed a little bit as a choral composer, even though I do write instrumental music. But the majority of the work that I write is generally commissioned works, and so that sort of looks like a school or an organization coming to me and saying, look, we'd love a new piece for our 150th anniversary concert or our speech night or our music showcase, and we just bought a new marimba, so we'd love you to showcase the marimba.
Yes.
And so with that brief, I sort of go away and, I'll often ask them if they have any thematic things that they want to have tied into the music, if they've got any text. I really enjoy finding texts myself and also writing my own. And then there's a little bit of toing and froing. between whichever the commissioning organization is and me. But generally, I'm sort of left to my own devices. And I will then sort of go and write the piece. I try and get as much information as I can from them in terms of, the strengths and weaknesses of the various ensembles, how much longevity or value we can kind of get out of the piece after that initial performance, and what that might look like in terms of perhaps doing a slightly simpler arrangement that doesn't involve, every Tom, Dick, and Harry at the school or whatever it is. And then I will give them an initial draft. And generally, I've been doing this long enough to sort of know what works and what doesn't work, and often what choirs, particularly amateur choirs, are kind of looking for in a newly commissioned piece of music. And so, yeah, I sort of pride myself on it essentially being a bit of a business, really. You're providing a product, you're providing a service at often quite a great expense, for some of these community organizations where they don't have a lot of money. And you want to get it right. So, yeah, I'm often, I'm really listening to them, but I do really appreciate them allowing me to kind of just do my thing.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, it's so important to get all the information you can about the ensemble and, as you said, strengths and weaknesses and what kind of orchestration they're going to be having or not. And I like what you said about creating a piece that's got a bit of mileage, so that it's not just like a one-time performance of this anniversary piece. It's like, no, this is something that can stay in our repertoire and we can bring it out for other events, not just this one-time
Absolutely.
performance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important, because essentially what these people are doing is contributing to a larger kind of, well, in this case, choral music, choral canon. And if the piece only gets one performance and then sort of gets shelved and never performed again, I think they're really doing themselves a disservice, as being someone that has really invested financially in the forwarding of contemporary Australian music. And this commissioning culture that we have is really unusual. It doesn't really happen in any other country,
Really?
particularly at the amateur level. Schools commissioning new pieces sort of happens to a lesser degree in the States, but here it's a really prevalent thing. And I think as composers, we're really lucky, to have choral directors and artistic directors take risks, and commission new music.
Yeah, I didn't realize that the commissioning thing was strong in Australia compared to other places. That's really
Yeah,
interesting.
absolutely, absolutely. Particularly at an amateur level, that's why we have this wealth of music, particularly choral music, that is really pitched at younger voices, at amateur voices, unauditioned choirs, and that's a really, yeah, really unusual thing.
Yeah, one of my previous guests was Annie Kwok, and shout out to Annie. And Annie, aside from saying that she has worked with some of your pieces with some of her groups, which is cool, she said that she thinks Australian choirs have something that the rest of the world doesn't. It's just some sort of how did she put it? Like they strike an interesting balance between, what did she say, vibrancy and technicality, something like that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'd agree with that to some degree.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So I noticed on your SoundCloud there is some non-choral stuff. In fact, and non-instrumental stuff. It's like electronic stuff. I'm curious about
Uh,
that because I like that stuff a lot.
I do. So this was so I haven't actually touched my SoundCloud account for many years now. And there was a stage when I was really sort of getting into home recording, and I had a little studio set up, and I was really kind of playing around with popular and electronic music, using both Logic and Ableton Live.
Ah,
And
yes,
it
I
is
use
something that
Ableton Live. I use
yeah,
Ableton.
yeah, I do really enjoy that. I haven't sort of had too much time to do it recently. I don't know, maybe it's my ADHD finding other things to kind of hyper focus on, and have those things fall by the wayside. But I do enjoy that, and I certainly listen to popular music probably more than I do classical music.
Hmm. I really liked that one track, "Forever in a Day." It was just very, very chill, very
Ah, yeah,
relaxed. It's very
cool.
cool.
Thank you.
So, tell us about the groups that you currently work/sing with.
Sure. So I've been in Canberra since October 2018. So I had a whole year here before we had the pandemic shut down everything. And I sort of arrived at a good time. There were a couple of choirs that were seeking new choral directors. Um, and I was really lucky to sort of pick up the mantle with both of those. And they were the Canberra Choral Society and the Oriana Chorale. And so the Canberra Choral Society has just recently celebrated its 70th anniversary. It's been going since since the early 50s, and they have traditionally been the sort of larger symphonic choir that's performed with with orchestra. And so we, as part of our regular programming, will do combined concerts with both sort of scratch professional choirs and also the National Capital Orchestra, which is another sort of uh, amateur orchestra, but quite good. And we'll put on sort of cornerstones of the repertoire, things like we did the Rossini Petit Messe Solennel quite recently. We've done the Haydn Seasons. We'll do a Messiah every couple of years, as well as doing concerts that are slightly more austere and smaller. So at the moment, we're working on a program of Bach, doing a couple of the motets, as well as a couple of other bits and pieces from the various passions. So that's that group, and the I also am the director of the Oriana Chorale, which is a really lovely chamber choir, although it's sort of pushing the boundaries of what we could probably call a chamber choir at the moment. I think we've got about 34 to 35 members. And we do a huge variety of repertoire. And I think one of the things that is really important and fabulous about choral music is that it is found in nearly every culture on earth. We all have a voice, and all of these cultures have a different choral sound. They have amazing repertoire to kind of to bring to the table, and I think one of our jobs as choral conductors is to explore the different sound worlds, explore the different colors that the human voice has to offer. And so through Oriana, we'll do contemporary Australian repertoire. We'll do music from the 16th century Italy. At the moment, we're working on a program that centers around these two pieces by Ole Yelo, who's a Norwegian composer but lives in New York. And that's coupled with a couple of pop song arrangements that I've done. So diversity is the key, diversity in repertoire for that one. And I also sing with a fabulous vocal quintet/sextet, depending on the project, called Luminescence Chamber Singers, and the artistic director of which is AJ America. And she is very much a sort of mainstay in the choral scene in Canberra as well. And again, we do a huge variety of repertoire, and it's really lovely to sing, in that small ensemble sort of scenario where you are the only person singing your part. And it really allows each singer to kind of bring their own timbre and their own musicality to the table.
That's so cool. And what about Canberra Community Chorale? You guys are you
Yes.
still
Oh,
with
Canberra
those guys?
Community Chorale. They are they are the most fabulously enthusiastic bunch of, again, mostly retirees, completely unauditioned, and they rehearse on a Friday afternoon. I've got them from 12:30 until 2:30 on a Friday afternoon, and they also do a variety of repertoire. Sometimes they have to trust my judgment. And we have just recently done a concert again of Bach, actually, and we're about to embark on a concert of some of my own music and the Fauré Requiem, which will be really, really exciting. But I think one of the things that I find challenging as a conductor who has worked with a lot of really, really fabulous ensembles, and now finds himself working, professionally with Luminescence, but also working with real, amateur choirs, is managing my expectations. And I feel like I'm very hard on my choirs. I am very happy to heap praise on them when it's required or when it's due. But I'm also constantly pushing them to to excel. And so it's really, particularly with groups like Canberra Community Chorale, it's really in that 2 hours striking the balance between allowing them to sing and have a great time and socialize, but also to make great music. And For me, that's the challenge of sort of finding that balance that sort of keeps everybody happy.
It is a hard balance to strike sometimes. Because you want to pursue excellence, and I think like every choir conductor has like a template in their head, or like an idea of what the sound is that they're going for, that they want, and we're trying to nudge people in this direction. But we also, yeah, especially in a community ensemble, it's like these people are here to have fun. They want to sing. They want to sing the song the whole way through. They don't want to be stopped.
Yep.
And so we've got to balance these things and go, all right, I aim for like a few moments of musical perfection, or
Yeah,
musical
definitely. And
beauty
look,
in every rehearsal.
totally. And to be honest, one of the things that I've discovered is that regardless of if they are, absolute professionals or whether, they've only been singing in choirs for the past sort of 3 or 4 months, they're all their own biggest critics. They know when they've done a good job and they know when they haven't done a good job. They don't need me to necessarily say that. And so, part of the process is really nurturing and giving confidence, and also sharing my passion, because I feel like if I'm enthusiastic about a piece or enthusiastic about a way of unpacking vocal pedagogy, then I think they'll be absolutely keen to go along for the ride. um, and so having feedback from those singers, particularly those in amateur groups like Canberra Community Chorale, where they will come up and tell me that something I've said has really resonated with them, that makes me feel like I've done my job.
That's great. Yeah,
Yeah,
enthusiasm is so key. It's like people more readily will follow a captain who knows what the destination is, and who
absolutely.
who talks about it and go, when we get here, it's going to be so good. And yeah.
Yeah.
How did music enter your life?
Um, I grew up in a vaguely musical family. My mother had us. I have two siblings, and we were all learning piano from not a super young age. I think I started around, I was 9 or 10 when I started playing piano. And I always hated practice. I never really wanted to play the pieces that I was given. I just wanted to sit at the piano and kind of improvise. I really hated doing scales. Um, but I sort of persevered, and I had a really fabulous piano teacher who was very supportive of um, my wishes to kind of go off on tangents and improvise and write little pieces, but also hyper aware that my mother wanted me to to achieve and do Amy B exams and the like. So that's where I started, and then I went to a high school that had an absolutely extraordinary music program, and I started singing in the choirs at the same time I started doing classroom music, which was in year nine, second year of high school. And when we were in year 11, we did a film music unit. And I decided I wanted to be a film music composer. I just wanted to be the next John Williams. I wanted to, go to Hollywood. And my path diverged slightly from that. I'm still very much into film music. I just don't write it for films. I write it for unwittingly, yes, teen choirs.
I think I can hear that in your composing, because it's very evocative and visual a lot of the time.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think
I do get a lot of inspiration from film music. I also get a lot of inspiration from actually watching films. And I'll take thematic material from films that I've seen and put them in a piece of music. Um, but yeah, that's where it all started. It was piano to start with, and then singing in choirs and picking up other instruments at high school.
so. Where did you grow up? What was your
I
hometown?
grew up in Brisbane, and I went to Brisbane Grammar, which had a really fabulous music department, and then went on to study composition at the Queensland Con. And I was there till about year 2000, and then moved to Sydney in 2002, and sort of did about 12 or 13 years there, and then did a brief stint in Melbourne, and then up in Canberra. So sort of done the East Coast.
Best Coast. um, so it's really cool that your piano teacher, let you indulge your compositional, curiosities at an early age. I think that probably helped a lot.
Yeah, yeah, no, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, those nurturings sort of translated quite well, into the context of music in an academic sense, where a large part of the curriculum at school was actually writing compositions. And I absolutely adored, writing music. I wasn't writing choral music initially. It was mostly sort of piano driven stuff because that was my background. And then obviously as I started singing more, I through my um, conservatorium days, I was also singing with the Australian Voices under the direction of Graham Morton and then Stephen Leake, and had the opportunity to write some choral music and have it performed through that organisation too. So
Oh yeah.
that really sort of laid the foundations for very much steering me in the direction of writing music for choirs rather than writing music for orchestras. And I think probably in hindsight that the choral scene is probably a lot more lucrative. You know, from all accounts, film music is a cutthroat game.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
But wow, okay, I didn't know that you sang with the Australian Voices, and that's what an awesome opportunity to be able to write something for them to sing.
yeah, yeah. I had the opportunity to write quite a few pieces for them over the years, and one of the luxuries of sort of being in an ensemble where you've written music for them is to be able to workshop that music and really tailor
Mm,
it to the group that you've got. And so I learnt a lot through that experience, and I've been lucky enough to have that experience several times sort of through my career. And it's a real, you know, we're always trying to write idiomatically for whatever instrument it is that we've got. And one of the things that we know about voices is they are so different. And so, sort of being in the thick of it and hearing, what the sound of the sopranos is or what the sound of your baritone is, if you're writing for a quintet or whatever it might be, is really useful because you can then, write to their strengths.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And if you're writing for, cool, very cool that you could write and workshop for TAV, the Australian Voices, because I imagine they could just sight sing it off the page and sound pretty good. So,
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I mean, they were all really fine musicians, and their reading skills were really great. I must admit, though, this was early on in my career, and I hadn't written a lot of choral music. And the first rehearsal or two is always fraught, because you're sort of hearing it for the first time, and you're hearing them read it for the first time, and of course they're not reading the music in the way that they would perform it, and you start second guessing yourself right from the word go. You go, oh, I should have written that. Oh, no, that sounds terrible. Oh, what was I thinking with the dynamics there? But it all comes out in the wash once they've actually got it under their belts. Um,
yeah,
so yeah, formative years.
and your sense of what works and what doesn't, that develops at the more you
Oh,
do it.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Tiniest whisper starts raising motion. Echo lies within, it shimmers and trembles. A diaphragm pulses, pulses with each eternal syllable. Into
So You had some pretty awesome choir experiences early on. How did that transition into choir leading?
So when I was in Sydney, when I first moved to Sydney, through the Australian Voices and through Stephen Leake, I met Lynn Williams, who is the director of Gondwana Choirs. Gondwana Choirs didn't really exist when I started in Sydney back in 2002-ish. She had a Sydney Children's Choir, and in the first year that I was in Sydney, I was their composer in residence. And so I wrote a variety of music from the senior choir, who was sort of a very, auditioned 13 to 16-year-old kids, right through to what they called back then the minis, who were 6 and 7-year-olds. And that was probably the greatest learning experience for me, particularly writing for really young voices. That was a real eye opener. But I, through that initial contact, began starting to conduct, some of the various choirs in that organization, and then was also doing some work conducting in schools in New South Wales as well. So it seemed like a kind of a logical progression in a lot of ways, particularly as I was sort of so entrenched in the choral scene. It sort of made sense that I would also wave my arms around as well as actually write the tunes. So yeah, that's how that came about, and I've sort of been doing it since. I've taken choirs, had choirs in Melbourne, and of course here in Canberra, and I sort of now, I mean, I've always considered myself a choral composer, but I now sort of feel like I am a choral specialist with a slightly diverse portfolio. So I'm singing and I'm conducting and I'm writing music for choirs, and that seems to be my pigeonhole that I sort of created for myself.
Sure, yeah. When did you like the first time you got up to conduct a group? Was that with one of Lynn Williams' groups?
Probably, probably. I have a series of terrifying moments in my conducting career. One of which was actually conducting my own piece. And this was, again, sort of only a couple of years after I'd moved to Sydney. And I had written this piece for the senior choir called The Dancers, and it was based on a Michael Dransfield text, and it was insanely difficult. It had mixed meter all over the place. There was a moment when half of the choir was in a combination of 7/8 and 9/8, and then the other half of the choir was in 4/4. And it had stops and starts all over the place. And the choir was due to go down for a tour to Adelaide as part of a choral fest that was happening down there. And then I had to end up conducting that choir at that event at the 11th hour. And part of their program was this particular piece. And I have never been more terrified conducting a piece in my life. I made it intensely difficult. And the way that concert program worked was that piece was then followed by Carl Jenkins's Ariamus, which is kind of one of those pieces that in the choral world we say sings itself. And I couldn't get to that piece fast enough. So yeah, it's it's one of those things. And again, you learn the craft and you learn the techniques, but in those early days I was very much just trying to keep my head above water.
Yeah. After the experience with the extremely difficult piece, did you develop a bit of sympathy for the conductor and going, "Oh, okay, maybe I should factor that
Absolutely,
in when I'm
absolutely.
composing"?
And funnily enough, in the workshopping process for that piece, in the compositional workshopping process for that piece with Lynn, she had said several times that this is really difficult, Dan. It changes meter a lot. It has these stops and starts and these changes of tempi and all of this. And I was like, oh no, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. And the kids are fine with it. Like kids are absolutely amazing at singing difficult music. You just don't tell them that it's hard, and it's fine. But when you've got the score in front of you and you see 7/8 followed by 9/8 followed by 2/4 followed by this followed by that, that it's difficult. And so after having conducted it in Adelaide, I did go back to Lynn and say, oh, I'm really sorry about that.
That's so funny. So when you're in front of a choir leading a rehearsal, What's your favorite warm-up exercise?
I have quite structured warm-ups. They don't tend to go for very long. If I've got a 2-hour rehearsal, I will probably do it for about 10 minutes. And I will generally start with exercises that get the breath going. But I also really love doing warm-up songs and little ditties that not only warm the voice up, but warm the brain up. And so, I've got a couple of different songs that include actions, doing arm patterns in 2 different times, or having a piece that's in 3/4, but the movement and clapping pattern is in 4. And it's one of these things that when you're really good at it, it's sort of pointless because you can kind of do it on autopilot and it defeats the purpose of it. But while the choir is really struggling with it, they're really trying to I guess triage the important elements of the exercise and get those right. And often the singing tends to fall by the wayside as soon as the arms and stuff get moving around. But I really enjoy those. I particularly enjoy doing those things with my older choristers, because I feel like they, if they're sort of getting um, a choir rehearsal and some calisthenics in, it's probably a good thing.
Is this so? What you've just described, I think maybe I know the one you're talking about. Is this the "Let's put the rooster in the stew"?
Oh yes,
Yeah,
yes,
I first heard it from our mutual friend Lucas, and then also from Olivia Swift.
yep,
Where you do have one arm doing up down like in 2, and the other one going up forward down in 3.
yes, yes.
And you're singing at the same time.
Yes, yeah, and if the choir's really good, you can get them singing it in 4-part canon and doing the patterns. Yes,
Yeah.
it's a good one because in the process of teaching this warm up, most of my choirs kind of know it now. But if you're teaching this warm up to a choir that's never done it before, it's very sort of stage driven. We'll do it in unison, we'll phrase at a time, and I really kind of get them to focus on the pitch and the intervallic relationship between those pitches. And then we'll do it in 2-part canon, and then we'll do it in a 4-part canon, and then we'll do it back in unison with just a simple, up down arm movement with both arms doing the same thing. And then we'll do one with the pattern of 3, and then we'll do one where one hand does 3 and the other hand does 2. And it's at that point when they start all looking like they're at a YMCA flash mob. But yeah, it's a good one. It is a good one.
There's a lot. Yeah, it's a simple exercise in theory, but there's a lot of steps and a lot you can drill down on.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And of course, in warm ups, I'm also, we are there to warm up the voice and the brain at the same time. And so generally, a warm up will consist of some more gentle things to start with, sort of get nice, relaxed and high larynxes, low larynxes, which is kind of what we're after. And then I also will incorporate sort of theoretical elements. So I'm always talking about scale degree numbers when we deal with warm-ups that have any kind of scalic element. Scale degree 1 being obviously the tonic, scale degree 5 being the dominant, and not just thinking about those scale degree numbers in their, numerical order, but how they relate to scale degree 1 to create intervals. And I feel like you can unpack that theory knowledge in a way that translates well when it comes to sight reading repertoire. Particularly pieces that are, are not particularly complicated harmonically. I often will try and get my choir to kind of unpack what's happening, in terms of a chord at any given time, so that their line has context rather than them sort of just, singing and learning by rote.
I like that. Do you use solfa to do this or something else?
Look, not really. I don't come from a Kodai background. I totally get the merits of solfa. We did solfa at when I was studying at the con, but I didn't find it particularly helpful because I don't think we were kind of doing it in the right way. If you go and study music in continental Europe, solfa is just de rigueur. And actually, if you go to France, You know, if you say the note C, they'll look at you strangely because C is not C, C is do.
Yes.
So I generally will kind of cherry pick bits and pieces from various methods, whether it's Kodai or the Orff Schulwerk method or anything else, to the work for the way that I like to work. And I sort of, hope that generally the choirs will get it.
Yes, as long as they understand, yeah, you're talking about scale degrees 1 through 8 or 1 through 7, things like that. So, what's your process for choosing new repertoire?
Um, I I do listen to a lot of music, and I'm often on social media groups where new music sort of passes across my feed. One of the really great ones is the American Choral Directors Association Facebook page. There is just a lot of new music on there, and as I'm kind of programming various concerts for various ensembles through the year, I'm always trying to create a variety. And so occasionally I'll actually put it to the choir. They can sort of suggest pieces or suggest programs that I take under advisement. One of the paradigm shifts, I guess, in the last couple of years is representation of female composers in programs, and I do, where I can, really try to have that representation there in a meaningful and not tokenistic way, and that can be challenging because you do, as a conductor, need to sort of actively seek that music out. We composers generally aren't very good at blowing their own trumpets, and so I very rarely will have people sort of come to me and say, "Oh, look, I've written this piece and I'd love you to perform it," or whatever it is. You have to go out and actively seek it. So we'll do programs of early music and of extant repertoire from the 19th and 20th century. But for new music, you've really got to dig, because unfortunately, I think time allows the wheat from the chaff to separate, of its own volition. There would have been, we'd sort of look at the classical music period, there would have been 20 Mozart-esque composers. But now, 250 years later or so, there's only one Mozart, really. And we don't have that luxury. There's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of stuff that is really not great music. There is a lot of stuff that is really great music, but it's hard to find those good pieces in amongst the rest when
because it hasn't
necessarily have lots of performances.
Yeah, it hasn't had to undergo the test of time.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
I can see how that would be a problem. Yeah. And it's vast time scales as well, especially if we're talking about classical or earlier eras.
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
Well, people have been playing this for 200 years. It must be all right.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, one of the reasons I really like to do a diverse repertoire or diverse programming over the course of the history of kind of Western choral music, so we're sort of going back to 14th, 15th century, is that for every one of these periods there is a different performance practice. And I think I hear lots of choirs kind of sing early music and 19th century German music and contemporary Australian music all the same way, and I feel like that's a real disservice and it's slightly kind of naive or ignorant way of approaching it. You don't have to really kind of dig too hard to find great exponents of early music performance or 19th century Germanic performance or contemporary Australian performance, on YouTube or on other recording sort of media. And I'm always trying to get my choirs to kind of explore these different sound worlds and these different techniques that were used to sing this music, well, to our best understanding back in the day.
Yeah, so singing in a historically informed way. I realize
Absolutely.
there's
Yeah.
quite a movement these days to do that, not just in choral stuff, but
Oh,
Baroque era
everywhere.
stuff,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
when you've got a new piece of music, how do you go about introducing it to the choir?
Um, Generally, if it's a new piece that they don't know, we'll just start by sight reading it. We'll just have a sing. And depending on the quality of the choir, we might get to bar three or we might get all the way through the piece. And I don't really want to say too much, to preface that or to sort of color their opinion of it. I just want to have a bit of a sing through and sort of see where it lands. If it's a piece that I've been able to kind of source the provenance of the history, if there's a sort of backstory to it, then I will share that obviously with the choir. I do really enjoy kind of going off on and having rambles about composers or about what was happening at the time that this piece was written politically or geographically or whatever it might be. And then we'll kind of we'll unpack it. But I think just trying to have a good old sing right from the word go is a good way to start.
Do you question the singers sometimes and go, say, like, we've just sung through this piece for the first time. What did you notice? What jumps out at you? Do you sometimes question them?
Sometimes, yeah. I Again, depending on the choir, and I often will find with some of my choirs, actually particularly with Canberra Community Chorale, they're very curious, and that they're all very well seasoned travelers. So they've heard music sung all over the world. They travel a lot. I've got people from a sort of diverse range of backgrounds there. And they will ask me questions before I get the opportunity to ask them questions, which is kind of nice. I do really try and get my choirs to be singing with their ears open, all the time. And I'm asking them, if particular sections of the music might kind of require or suggest a certain tone color or a certain sort of vocal device to be appropriate. And if I can elicit those responses from them, I feel like that's a better way of doing it rather than being hugely prescriptive.
Yeah, so use leading questions.
Yeah,
to be like,
absolutely.
how should we sing, section C of this song?
Yeah, or what can we do on this particular long note so that the energy gets transferred to the note that follows it, or whatever it might be. I think they need to sort of be thinking about the sound that they're making and taking responsibility for their own actions. And I think the best way to do that is actually get them really thinking about what it is that they're doing. I find often, choristers are very quick to revert to singing on autopilot. And I don't think we can ever really do that. And I know that lots of instrumental players certainly don't do that. We want to find the colors and find the shapes and realize what the composer probably wanted, And the more that they're aware of that as individuals and not sort of riding on the coattails of the singers around them, I think the better off an ensemble will be.
How do you attract new singers to your choir?
Oh, that's a tough question. That's a tough question. For those listening outside of Canberra, Canberra is a real hotspot for classical music, particularly choral singing. I feel like there are more choirs here per capita than in any other city in Australia, and that is a blessing and a curse. Obviously, we have, as a smaller city, we've only got 400,000 people or so living in Canberra. We have a very finite audience. And we also have a very finite pool of singers with which to draw from. And so as a result, you will find singers that are singing in 3 or 4 different choirs. And that's all well and good, but the other thing that is happening with the demographic that is really interested in choral singing is that they're starting to age out. A lot of the choirs that I direct are older. The members are older. A lot of retirees, and even though we have a now almost thriving School of Music as part of the Australian National University. And there are younger choristers kind of coming through. I have found that there's not a lot of representation in that middle section, which is, either young professionals or, working professionals that want to sing as part of their kind of, their weekly activities. And so I'm finding it really hard to replace those singers that age out and decide that, I can't commit to this choir physically or, time wise or whatever it is. And they're getting imbalanced. So tenors and basses, if you're out there and you want to come and sing, give me a holler. I have found actually with Oriana, my chamber choir, we don't have that problem. I have, a lot of younger singers sort of coming through the ranks, and I think it's a bit of a word of mouth thing as much as anything. There have been quite a few university age students that have come to Canberra to study from either Sydney or Melbourne who have come through the ranks of the Gondwana choirs program, and they're now coming back to sing, and that's really great because they already have a wealth of experience as choristers and as well-rounded musicians. But I'm really not sure what the answer is, on a global level to getting people to come sort of back to choirs. I think everyone found COVID really decimated the ranks a little bit, and I have found, particularly with my older members or the choirs that consist of older members, that there's still a little bit of reluctance to come back, because there is still that, the shadow of COVID kind of lingering, which I would love to have disappear.
Yes, there is. There was a slight post-COVID boom, at least that I saw in my choirs too, where once most people felt safe again doing social activities again, they were like, heck yeah, I want to sing in a choir again.
Yeah.
They came out. Possibly not across all demographics, you're right, but
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that a lot of people felt was they realized how much they missed it and how important it was, not just for the music making, but also for their own, mental health and socialization and all of those things. So, look, I'm pretty confident things will sort of get back to normal. But yeah, we just need to do a bit of a recruiting drive and get particularly men, get men sort of back into singing and have some really fabulous, large, well balanced choirs.
Absolutely. Tell me about the audition processes of your various groups.
So they differ in, I guess, in the depth depending on which choir it is. So for Oriana Chorale, for example, the audition process is probably a little bit more stringent than it is for Canberra Choral Society. The audition generally consists of me having a listen to their voice and sort of see what they're doing. You know, I ask their background, what part they've sung in the past, and we'll kind of go through and usually use a couple of simple warm-up exercises for me to gauge what their voice is doing through the various parts of their register. I'll ask them if I've got time. I'll ask them to sing something unaccompanied and simple. And a good one for that is just to get them to sing a really simple folk song, you know, in a way that is folky, not, you know, like a Britain arrangement where it sounds like it has been kind of classified. Um, and then there'll be a sight reading component. And that's the bit that freaks everyone out. But I do try and allay their fears as much as I can at the beginning of the process, and let them know that, you know, it's sight reading isn't quite as scary as everyone sort of makes it out to be. But that's it essentially. So generally, an audition for a choir will take somewhere between 10 and 12 minutes.
Cool.
Yeah.
So that's Oriana, and you said Canberra Community Chorale's non-auditioned.
That's unauditioned. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyone can come along and have a sing in that one.
Cool. And Canberra Choral Society is a little bit just not as stringent as the.
It's auditioned. We have in the past, part of the audition component for Canberra Choral Society was to sing a section of the Hallelujah chorus with a couple of other people around them. So they would essentially just have to hold their part. I didn't find that particularly useful because I would often find that people think that they know the Hallelujah chorus and they don't actually know the Hallelujah chorus. So I would have, you know, tenors come along and sing the Hallelujah chorus, but just sing the soprano part down the octave.
I was gonna say, and also
so-
maybe it's not all that representative of like range-wise of like typical repertoire.
No, definitely. So, I mean, getting them to sing something of their own choice is preferable for me. But I also find, you know, in doing that initial range finding thing and doing the warm-ups, I can get a quite good idea of what their voice is doing timbrally, and, you know, where its strengths and weaknesses are, and obviously where the range is that allows me to place them in a spot in the choir that's going to be best for them.
Yeah, I've done auditions with some of my singers and discovered that someone who thought they were an alto was actually a soprano, and vice versa.
Oh,
Things
yeah.
like that.
Yeah, no, that
And
happens.
so it's like, oh, I'm glad we did this range check because you sound way better on the high notes than the low notes.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
So in the rehearsal space, in the rehearsal room, how do you go about creating a great rehearsal experience for your singers?
I think the actual rehearsal space, like the actual physicality of the space, is really, really important. And I think, you know, a space that is kind of devoid of distractions, that has, you know, a reasonable acoustic. I think, you know, an overly generous acoustic is probably more of a curse than a blessing.
Yeah.
And a warm space is particularly important in Canberra because a lot of them
Yes.
aren't. So they're the things that I've worked in lots of different rooms before. You know, we've had dress rehearsals with Canberra Choral Society where we've sort of come in at the 11th hour with the orchestra, and we haven't been able to necessarily rehearse in the performance space because hiring it for a rehearsal becomes prohibitively expensive. So often you're left rehearsing in, you know, one of these kind of multi-use halls in a school or a college, for example, and they're hideous, you know, and it's actually quite demoralizing and detrimental to that really key part of the rehearsal process. So I think finding a space that has a sense of, you know, familiarity, that has a sense of isolation in that there's no, you know, people coming and going at the other end of the room or whatever it might be, and something that has a little bit of an acoustic, that makes for a really good start. And
do you prefer a drier acoustic or
a little bit? I certainly prefer that to a super wet acoustic, because it encourages the choristers to create their own resonance rather than rely on the resonance of the space.
Totally.
And that is certainly something that we can all, as singers, you know, attempt to achieve because we have these amazing resonant, you know, sack bodies that have the ability to really kind of fill out a sound.
Yeah, that's it.
And
That's
so
it.
I feel like if we can do the hard work in the rehearsals and then we find a venue that has a nice acoustic, they feel like they don't have to work quite so hard in the performance, which is kind of nice.
That is nice. That is nice. I've just moved into a new house, and the place where I do my singing practice is quite ringy because it's got like a wooden floor, and
Yep.
I was like, I sound great in here. And then I
Yeah.
went to my mate's house for quartet rehearsal, and his lounge room, so it's like carpeted and very, very dead, very dry. I was like, I sound so bad in this room. What's going on?
Yeah. Yeah. It is one of those make or break scenarios almost. Yeah.
What do you hope that singers get out of coming to your choir?
Um, I more than anything, I want them to be inspired, and I want them to feel good about what they're achieving. Um, so the inspiration I think comes from me sharing my enthusiasm and my experience and hoping that sort of rubs off on them. And I generally find that to be a reasonably successful process. But I I want them to realize that it's not just about the performance. You know, choral singing is a very personal thing. We have a voice that is very much our own voice, and we are making ourselves vulnerable every time we open our mouths and sing. There is a vulnerability and a very sort of intimate nature to actually expressing ourselves artistically through our own voice. And I want them to feel like they are allowed to do that, and allowed to make mistakes, but also that we sort of grow as an ensemble and learn things along the way. And obviously, you want the performance to be the best that you ever sing a particular piece of music, but at the end of the day, there are so many other factors involved in that performance. An audience, a quite often unfamiliar performance space, perhaps a different instrumental ensemble, all of these things that can result in a piece not being quite as good as it was in the dress rehearsal. And if that happens, it's not the end of the world. I think they are there because they want to be there. And my job is to make them feel like they want to come back next week.
Oh yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think because it's like 90% of what we do is rehearsing, and then 10% or less is performing. The rehearsals have got to be enjoyable. And
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like a group
back.
like Community Chorale, for example, we only do 2 performances a year. So we'll be working on the same repertoire for the better part of 5 to 6 months. And I can tell you, by the time we get to the concert, I'm really happy to put that music to rest. So it's about, not letting it get stale, finding new ways to have the choristers think about the music, working out a rehearsal strategy over that very long period that keeps it fresh. What are the things that we focus on at the beginning? What are the things we talk about, in that sort of mid-rehearsal slump? What are the things that we talk about, in the last 3 or 4 weeks of the rehearsal to really kind of pull it together for performance? And the longer the rehearsal process is, the harder that is, because you really need to, like a marathon runner, you need to really plan out your race and your tactics.
So do you find yourself sort of planning the term and going,
To some degree. As I become more familiar with my ensembles, I have to do that less because I kind of know, that over these first 4 weeks, I'll essentially be doing kind of note bashing, um, and we'll be working on getting an initial core sound, and then over the subsequent 5 or 6 weeks, we'll start talking about the nuances of the music, talk about the composer's intentions, give that music sort of context, um, and then in the last little bit of the rehearsal process, it's really about how do we communicate, how do we tell our story to the audience, and I think that sense of communication and that sense of storytelling is the absolute essence of why we sing. We are there to communicate. We are there to tell a story. And it breaks my heart to go to concerts where you'll hear an absolutely fabulous choir that is precise and in tune with their heads buried in the music that never make eye contact with the audience. It doesn't need to be that way. And I think some of my most memorable performances as an audience member have been with choirs that aren't necessarily the greatest choirs in the world, but they communicate in a way that really grabs you, at almost a visceral level. And I think that's something that every choir can achieve, whether it's a bunch of 6 or 7 year olds all the way through to a professional choir.
yeah, well, we should explore that a little bit more, like what makes a good performance, because it's not always just high levels of musical excellence. I watched this performance actually just earlier today, on YouTube. The I don't know if you're aware of the international barbershop harmony scene much, but they've just had their international competition, and there's some incredible performances that occurred. And there's this one on YouTube of this quartet called Midtown doing a performance, and I watched it, and it's amazingly precise, and it's just like they got to the level where the singing, there's no distractions in the singing anymore, which means you can focus on the performance of it. So it's like the singing is to such a high level that I didn't think about the singing until afterwards, and I was like, oh yeah, they sang really, really well.
That's really interesting.
Which is a good spot to be at with your group. These are all very talented singers. So what, like, yeah, tell us about, in your experience, what makes a good performance.
Um, One of the challenges, I think, as a potential audience member who is also, a choral conductor and a choral singer, and therefore has a probably more critical ear than your average audience member, is that we're probably listening for things that are far more inherently musical than your average concert goer who is there to, potentially follow the text in the program, or, sort of be wowed by the fact that there's 50 people on stage singing all at the same time and it all being coordinated. Um, I think I think for me, the most important thing, well, the key thing to a good performance is if you have communicated with the audience in some meaningful way. And I think some repertoire lends itself to that better than others. I find, there's a lot of music out there that potentially is a little bit too academic, or is, perhaps, an unfamiliar sound world. And so that process of communication is just that little bit harder. It's easy for a choir that's singing covers of pop songs for it to communicate with the audience because there is already that extant emotional connection to the music. And so I think that's the conundrum of the Messiah. People know the Messiah, they love the Messiah, they've heard, Beecham's recording of the Messiah from 1940, whatever it is, and so it kind of doesn't matter who's singing it. They'll just turn up and they'll hear the Hallelujah chorus, and that will be great. But if they're going along to hear, Gesualdo Tenebrae responsories that are incredibly complicated and grammatically, absolutely out of this world and audacious, and come from, the mind of an obviously hugely tormented soul. How do we translate that to the audience? How do we get them to sort of understand, who Gesualdo was, what his story is, where this music comes from?
You need to bring the audience halfway, don't you?
Yeah,
Like sort of
yeah,
educate them a little bit so that
a
they
little
can
bit, and I
fill in
sort
the
of,
gaps.
program notes are important, but also it's kind of cheating a little bit, because it sort of sets up an expectation for the audience, and it's easy for them to kind of make these tenuous connections with what they're supposed to hear because of the program notes and what they may or may not hear from the choir. Um, and so, like with all of my choirs, I do actually write program notes, but I tend to not talk very much about the pieces of music. I'll sort of give an overall thematic concept of the concert. I'll maybe talk about, like if it's all coming from a similar period, musically, then I might talk about, the geopolitical situation of the time. But I won't sort of talk about, this is what you will hear in this particular piece, and this is I need the music to kind of speak for itself. And then it's the job of the choristers to communicate what the composer was intending, or the text in a way that is successful.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting space to play in, the music as an abstract thing and the knowledge of the audience, like how much they know coming in. Because I was just thinking about like the exam. I was thinking of like what ensemble would say lean into the existing knowledge of the audience most of all. And it's probably like a covers band. So like a band that's playing covers aims to pick the most popular, well-known songs so that people who hear it and go, "Oh, I love this song," and they start dancing and singing along. Versus, say, I don't know, going to a concert where it's a whole program of music you've never heard before. You don't know if you like any of it in advance, and you know nothing going in. It's like going in blind. And so, like, there's a big distance between those two things. And so it's like if you're going along to a choral concert, and there's a number of us sort of entrenched choral nerds out there who'll go to it and go, "Oh, I know this program. I know everything. I've sung that one and that one." And then there'll be the concert goers who just like, "I don't know anything. I'm just coming along because my nephew's in the choir."
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting because, for us, as choristers going in and listening to a concert, that our performance, we might love a piece not necessarily just for its musical quality. We might love it because that reminds us of a time that we were singing with a choir that was full of our peers, and we took it on tour, and we have all of these additional kind of emotional connections to that piece of music. And I think that's one of the things that makes, like the pub choir phenomenon, and the doing film music in concerts, and now video game music in concerts, is that there is an emotional connection there that transcends the music itself. I'll never forget doing a concert of quite obscure video game music in the town hall in Sydney, and the place was absolutely full. It was absolutely full, and they flew some of these composers, mostly Japanese composers, out to sort of be guests for this particular concert. And the MC would sort of talk about the music that we were about to perform, and he wouldn't necessarily talk about it in musical context. It would be, so this is the music you hear when you fight the boss on level 5 of the, and the crowd would absolutely go berserk. Because it's not necessarily about hearing that music; it's about that experience in the context of the video game.
Yeah.
Similarly, with pop music, if you hear a piece sung by a choir, you go, "Oh, I know that because I remember the original," and "Oh, I remember my girlfriend at the time. We listened to that together in the car on the way to the coast," or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So that's tapping into these emotions that we don't necessarily have, like listening to, Mahler 4 with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. That is essentially the entirety of that emotional experience unless you've been lucky enough to, to hear it with the, I don't know, Vienna Philharmonic or someone, or LSO or whoever it might be, and then you hear it, with an amateur orchestra here in Canberra. You go, it's not quite the LSO, is it? But it's one of the challenges that that we face. How do we make what we do relevant?
Totally. I went to this slight tangent. I went to a performance recently with the Phoenix String Quartet.
Ah, yeah, they're playing with us with Oriana on Saturday.
Oh, awesome! Oh,
yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah, you'll have to come.
I will. And they did a program of music by Joe Hisashi, who is the composer.
Joe Hisashi, the Miyazaki composer.
Yeah, for all the Studio Ghibli films. And yeah, I recognized a lot of it because I've seen most of those films. And yeah, it's just so fun and lighthearted. And yeah, as you're listening to it, you're like, oh, I remember which scene this music was from.
Absolutely.
And, yeah. So there's a lovely little connection there. But that music, I mean, yeah, it's hard to say, would I have enjoyed that music as much if I didn't know the references, didn't understand where it was coming from. It's,
hard to know. Because it's so inextricably linked with them. I mean,
linked.
You could go along and hear that music and not necessarily be particularly au fait with the films. And I mean, for my money, I think that music stands alone really well. And Joe Hisaishi is a concert composer as much as he is, well, almost as much as he is a film composer. So he certainly knows what he's doing.
What's your favorite kind of performance to do?
My favorite kind of performances are the ones where the music really resonates with the singers. And unfortunately, the repertoire that I choose doesn't necessarily please everybody. And sometimes, the process of actually pulling that music together can be hard work. And if it feels like it's hard work through that rehearsal process, then sometimes you sort of lose the enthusiasm of the choir. The most recent CCS concert, so Canberra Choral Society concert we did, was a concert that featured the Ole Yelo Sunrise Mass, this Norwegian composer that now lives in New York, as well as a new piece of mine that CCS commissioned as part of their 70th anniversary celebrations. And I could tell right from the beginning of that rehearsal process that the choir really enjoyed singing all of the program. And so the rehearsal process just becomes so much easier because I feel like they've invested in it. And that's evident at the end, in the final product as well. The concerts that I find, sometimes they're the most rewarding, but the ones that are often the most difficult are the ones where the music doesn't necessarily resonate with my choristers. And regardless of how much I tell them that it's, absolutely amazing and it's good for them and character building and blah, blah, blah. So
it's like green vegetables.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I'm yet to do Stimmung with them, so we'll see how that goes down.
Let's talk about some other things. What's important to you? What are a choir leader's most important skills?
I feel like we've kind of touched on some of those things already, but I think it is we are a conduit. I think we are basically a conduit between the choir and the audience, and I think we need to be demonstrative to the choir and not demonstrative to the audience. And so that essentially means getting the most out of your singers in a way that translates well for for your audience. Um, so I think you have to be a good communicator. You need to be a good time manager. You need to be a good people manager. Um, because there's often politics at play in the choir land, which I think is hilarious because it's just people singing. Anyway, but I think ultimately it's really about it's about being a good communicator and a good inspirer, to try and to share some of your own enthusiasm and hope that that enthusiasm is infectious.
So you mentioned about being a conduit. So it's a lot about getting out of the way. Would you say?
I think so. Yeah, to some degree. I mean, sometimes if depending on the choir that you're working with, sometimes you can get to a point in the rehearsal process. The rehearsal process, and then obviously the performance, where you have to actually do very little. And I love, occasionally we'll do pieces in concerts where I don't conduct at all. They conduct themselves. And I absolutely love that because it means, well, one, I don't have to do anything for that particular thing. I can sit back and listen. But also it allows them to take ownership of the situation. And they all then become so integral to, the starting of a phrase, to the making of musical decisions. Whereas if I'm out the front and being extremely kind of demonstrative in my gestures, then I'm making those decisions for them, on the fly. So yeah, that's part of the process. I think trying to kind of get to a point where you actually don't need to be spoon feeding them, every single bit of information that's on the page, when it comes to the concert. Yep.
Yeah, I had a guy called Rob Sequeira come in and coach me in my barbershop chorus recently, and that was a big part of what he was teaching me and the guys to do, which was the singers take ownership of the plan of the music. And so he'd had me stand in front of the group and conduct, but by doing as little as I could possibly do. You might have seen that. There's that video on YouTube of Leonard Bernstein conducting, and he's just got his hands by his sides and he's just raising his eyebrows.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, kind of like that. So like, just looking at the guys and maybe sort of showing the emotion on my face, but not doing anything with my hands.
Yes.
In so much as I could resist doing that.
Yeah.
And in some ways it got a little bit sloppier because the synchronization was out. But in a lot of ways it got better because the guys were like, oh, Dan's not going to show us what to do. I guess we have to do it. So yeah, ownership is taken back by the singers a lot in that way. To me it's about striking that balance, and you as the conductor have got to present an idea or ideal of what it could be like, and go and then can try and conduct it as best you can, but then eventually it's now your story. Do what you can with
absolutely.
with the story.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you.
What aspect of choir leading most excites you?
It's funny. I really enjoy the rehearsal process. I would be very, very content to be the chorus master for a fabulous symphonic chorus and never actually conduct them in concert. I really enjoy that process. I love rehearsing the music. I love, getting the best out of the singers that I can in the time that I have, and then handing them over to somebody else, knowing that they will do a good job because they've been well prepared.
Have you done that many times?
For me, it's not about the glory of performance. So I really enjoy those moments where I can see, I'll be explaining something, or we'll have kind of worked on a particular section, and then you can see on the faces that suddenly there's this light bulb moment for them, and they've clicked, and they can now, they can sing a phrase and feel comfortable about it, or they have suddenly, got this new insight into, this particular style of performance practice or whatever it might be. I love those moments, because I feel like, when they do have those light bulb moments, they really stay with them. It's not like me sort of verbal diary talking at them, about this and that and what else, and then having it sort of in one ear and out the other. You can see on their faces where they've got something that registers with them and that's going to stay with them.
Yeah. I got to ask though, because you're a composer too, do you get a special thrill out of when the choir is learning one of your pieces?
Totally. Yeah. Yes, and it's really interesting actually, having just had this experience with both Luminescence chamber singers. We did a big concert series recently called Of the Body, and the centerpiece of that concert was a 7-movement work that I wrote. And then with CCS, with this 70th anniversary concert piece, and it always comes out in the wash. The performance is always fabulous, and I always get a great buzz, premiering a piece. But I also sort of have to manage my expectations during that rehearsal process, particularly if you're then, in the case of Luminescence, a singer in amongst your peers and you've conducted the music. I often sort of get a little bit frustrated in those early rehearsals, going, why don't they know this? Why can't you do this? It's just this. But I feel like they need to know it to the level that I know it, which is absolutely impossible, of course, because I wrote the damn thing. But like I said, it all sort of comes out in the wash, and the thrill of hearing your piece, when it's really starting to click, and particularly when you can tell that you've done a good job writing the music for the forces that you have. That's something that never gets old.
What do you wish you were better at?
I wish I was. So one of the things I constantly struggle with as a conductor is switching off my performing mode. So one of the big no-nos as a conductor is actually singing at your choir while you're conducting, and I do that all the time, and I really need to stop, because essentially what you're doing is you're not hearing what they're doing, you're just hearing what you want to hear, which is what you're singing. And I've spoken to various people about this and how to manage this, because I feel as a singer I can vocal model phrases in a way that I think is really useful, but that needs to have a time and a place, and whether that's stepping away from behind the music stand to do that, and as soon as you're back behind the music stand, you're not singing, you're not mouthing words, you're demonstrating with your breath and with your gesture, and you're listening. So that's one of the things that I would really love to get better at.
That's a good one. Which choir leaders do you admire and respect?
I have always been enamored with the Baltic choral tradition. There is this absolutely extraordinary choral culture in those countries that were once part of the Soviet Union. So, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and of course, famously, their succession from the Soviet Union in 1989. Part of that was this singing revolution. In Tallinn, or just out of Tallinn, in Estonia, thousands and thousands of people came together to sing as essentially a protest against the sort of Soviet regime. And it wasn't long after that the whole thing sort of came crumbling down. But one of my favorite choirs is the Estonian Philharmonic Chamber Choir, and their director, who's been there for many, 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 many years, is a director named Tonu Kaljuste, and he is absolutely extraordinary. He just has he has built that choral sound, and that choral sound has been emulated by many, many other choirs all over the world. Um, Closer to home, when I was living in Sydney, was very lucky to be able to work with the song company under Roland Peelman. And Roland now has a very close relationship with Luminescence Chamber Singers because he spends so much time here as part of his role as director of the Canberra International Music Festival. And one of the things I absolutely love about Roland is he is not a singer. He has a terrible voice, and I'm sure he won't mind me saying that. He knows that. But he is an amazing musician and he is an amazing communicator with gesture. And he has an encyclopedic knowledge of a lot of the repertoire. And I am constantly learning when I get the opportunity to work with him. And I'm very thankful, for his um, experience and his real, yes, I mean, selflessness in a sense, in donating his time to lots of different groups around the place. So he is just a fabulous musician and a real asset to Canberra, and will be very sad when he, passes the mantle of the artistic directorship of the CIMF to somebody else.
What advice would you give to new choir leaders?
Mm. I think the big one would probably be confident in knowing that you probably know more than anyone else that's in front of you. One of the most crippling elements of being a choir conductor is self-doubt and questioning your own ability, whether it's your ability to just conduct a pattern of four, or your knowledge of the music that you're working on, or whatever it might be. But I think if you can maintain an air of confidence, knowing that what you are saying is going to be new to nearly everyone in front of you, and you can always sort of stay ahead of the eight ball in that sense. They won't know, they won't know how much musical experience you have behind you, whether it's 5 minutes before a rehearsal or 20 years of experience. And that confidence, the confidence that you have in yourself, will lead to the confidence that they have in themselves.
It's at the end of the day, I think singers want to sing and they want to have someone in front of them who's got a plan, who's like, we're going to sing it this way.
Totally. Yeah. And manage your rehearsal time is another big one. Yeah.
Yes. I don't do it that often anymore, but sometimes I will write a minute by minute plan just to keep me on track, on task. Because I can go down rabbit holes and spend 30 minutes on a song, and then except I was supposed to cover 4 songs in this amount of time.
Yeah. No, that is very much a thing.
Okay, you have a time machine and you can go back and give your younger self a piece of advice about choir leading. What do you say?
That's a tough one. really know. I don't really know. I feel like if I had a time machine, going back and giving myself choral directing advice is probably the last thing that I would do. Um,
Invest in crypto.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Tonight's lotto numbers will be. I I feel very lucky to have kind of had the trajectory that I have had, um, and I've been really lucky to work with various groups in a way that my career feels like it's been reasonably organic. You know, I've never really kind of made the decision to pursue, you know, children's choir conducting or pursue, you know, working with large unauditioned adult choirs. I feel like as a conductor, you should be able to try and, well, you should be able to do all of them. Because essentially the process and the communication is the same. Um, I I toyed with the idea at one stage of going overseas and doing some study, and it was more me being sort of in a comfort zone here that stopped me from doing that. I feel like if I could go back in a time machine and tell my younger self something, I would say go and do it. It's not that I necessarily regret it. I don't want to be living overseas and doing what I do, but I feel like we in Australia are in a very very small bubble, and there are lots of, you know, people that are ostensibly at the top of their game here that feel like there is nothing else to learn. And I think that is couldn't be further from the truth. You know, in terms of a singing culture and a choral culture and a we'll talk about, you know, a Western music culture, because that's essentially what we're doing as singers. We're performing in Western art music. We are so late to the party. There are people who are living in countries where, you know, that has been their culture for 400, 500, 1,000, 1,500 years. And I wish that early on in my career I had been exposed to that, in a little more of a first-hand way. So that's probably the thing that I would say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We've got to remember Australia's new.
It is a very small pond.
At
It
least in
really,
terms
really
of
is.
the
Yeah.
way we do our Western art music.
Yeah. And look, there are things that we do here that are absolutely amazing, absolutely extraordinary. You know, I mean, uh, in my first year of singing in the Australian Voices, we went on a US tour. So this would have been 1996. Um, and we were taking a program, or several programs, of mostly Australian contemporary repertoire. A lot of music of Stephen Leeks, people like Paul Stanhope, Matthew Orlovich, Clay McLean. Um, and we were performing music that had never been heard in the States before. You know, this what I tend to refer to as, you know, music by landscape composers, people like Stephen Leek, who are creating sounds of a place, sounds of a landscape. And, you know, some of these American audiences, they were like, we thought you had tape recorders squirreled around the church, you know, because we were making all of these you know, bird noises and animal noises that were coming from the stage, and they were absolutely blown away. You know, this was a sound world that was completely unfamiliar to them.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we very much have our own niche, but we still have so much to learn, so much to learn about, you know, about vocal pedagogy and about the the wider choral canon, and about, you know, exploring the possibilities that the voice has to offer.
Amazing. Dan Walker, everybody. How can people follow you and your groups?
Look, I'm pretty hopeless on social media. I do have an Instagram account that doesn't really have anything to do with what I do work-wise. It has more to do with what I like doing in my spare time, which is a little bit daggy. But all of my groups have Facebook and Instagram presences. Oriana Chorale and Canberra Choral Society. You can both find them on Facebook. I do have a website, danwalkercomposer.com, that is in desperate need of a revamp. Otherwise, I am very contactable, either through Facebook or Instagram or through my website. So yeah, I'm out there.
Thanks, Dan.
No worries. Thanks so much. It's been great to talk.
I hope you enjoyed the interview with Dan Walker today. One of the biggest ideas I'll be pondering is program notes. How much information is the right amount to give your audiences in a performance? Is it cheating to give your audience lots of information about the music? Should the music be able to stand up on its own merit? Let us know what you think. If you want to find out what Dan Walker is doing next, check out the show notes for links to his choirs and online presence. You'll also find links to the recordings you heard in today's episode. Finally, I'd like to thank you for listening. I so enjoy interviewing and learning from all of the fantastic choir leaders who appear on the show. There's so much gold here. It would be a crime not to share it. The bigger this community gets, the more choir leaders we can talk to, and the stronger our up-and-coming generation of choir leaders will be. So, share an episode with someone. Mention your favorite bit. Give the podcast a rating on Spotify. We're going to leave you now with a recording of Dan Walker's composition, This Secret World.